Welcome to the world of science fiction stories, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe my channel. Enjoy the listening. They warned us, but the human experiment couldn't be stopped. There were a million different thoughts going through JY's head, but the most important was that their companion, the human Robert, was dead. Their escape pod had barely made it off the ship as the pirates continued to sabotage, loot, and destroy every deck they encountered. Robert had been working with JY in their lab when the boarding occurred, and without being prompted, he had worked tirelessly to help move JY's molecular sieve into the escape pod as well before he closed the pod door and strapped in for their descent. It had been the entire reason for their research partnership, a fascinating and powerful tool, yet complex and requiring enormous energy reserves to operate. He had smiled at them, saying, "Perhaps it might come in handy wherever we end up," but JY knew it was more than that. Robert was aware of just how important and almost sacred the molecular sieves were to their species. Now, as JY took account of their bruises, scrapes, and scratches, they could see that Robert had been thrown between the bulky compartment of the molecular sieve and the wall of the escape pod during their rough descent and crash. He coughed and moaned in pain before he managed to spit out between coughs of blood, "Be sure to give my gold and silver to Gabriel." JCK recognized that as being the human woman Robert had called his partner, occasionally glimpsed in the background of his computational tablet. They did not understand what he had meant until he gave the alien a knowing look and patted the top of the molecular sieve he was pinned against. JCK had tried to sputter an objection, but Robert had already passed, the light fading from his eyes as he slumped forward, his arms limp, blood dribbling slowly from the corner of his mouth. Even then, JCK had wanted to refuse, knowing that humans, unlike their own species, viewed disassembly of the dead down to base elements as uncommon rather than the norm. Robert had mentioned something about cremation, but when JY had asked for details, he had described an incredibly imprecise and wasteful process involving carbonization of materials and reduction to an unrefined composite ash. But upon reviewing their circumstances after the crash, JY was less than enthused by the other options available. They had crashed toward the edge of a large forest, but the trees here were some sort of odd silicate, almost mineral-like in their shape and structure. While any fallen log would certainly provide plenty of grist to feed into the molecular sieve, JY could already tell with a practiced eye that it would be mostly silica, carbon, and perhaps a few other trace elements. The shapes were far too linear and repeatable to hope for many impurities. Even then, the final clincher was the damage to the molecular sieve itself. The two-part display had been damaged, and while the elemental highlight and selection panel was only slightly cracked, an impact against a bulkhead had shattered the mount that actually stated the quantity the sieve detected for extraction. That meant that anything JCK hoped to salvage from this unknown moon would be a complete shot in the dark. Additionally, now it was disconnected from the ship's reactor, the internal battery reserve would only have enough for a limited amount of conversion, meaning there was no chance for trial and error to try and discover anything useful to survive. Then their gaze returned to the still and silent form of Robert, their closest companion and research partner for nearly the last 3 solar cycles, and snippets of an old Earth poem he had taught them began to filter through their mind. "These are the things that make a man." Knowing they had no better option, JCK made their way back to the crashed escape pod, leveraging a seatback that had been wrenched loose in the landing to create enough space between Robert and the device for his form to slump to the side, enabling them to pull his corpse free. They keyed the access code into the sieve, sighing in relief as the machine hissed open to accept whatever was fed into it. Robert slid down into the device, and JCK gave him a final murmur of gratitude before the hatch sealed shut and began to hum as the human body was processed. Things skittered across the stony branches outside the shuttlecraft, and JYK found themselves wishing fervently for a weapon. Then they remembered the first lines of the poem Robert had recited, "Iron enough to make a nail." Opening the access panel, they were surprised by the sheer range of elements present, some Robert had never mentioned, and those ones they suspected would amount to no more than a few grains of material at most. But iron, at least, was something one could use to make a tool or, more relevant to the sound of movement outside, a weapon. They entered the output dimensions, wincing at the power consumption estimate. Producing something structured rather than simply exuding raw elements was costly, but it was necessary. The inbuilt backup battery would have enough power to render everything within something as small as a human like Robert, though it would certainly fail before managing to process even half of one of the great stone-like trees looming outside. The sieve rumbled and hissed, a keening whine from the centering laser echoing around the small canyon they had crashed within, until the hatch slid open. Within was a modest knife, less than a dozen cm long, thin with a dulled but slightly thicker grip. Certainly not enough for Jine to defend themselves against anything bigger than small scavengers, but it was a start, at least something to reassure them in case of attack. The next lines of the poem sprang forward unbidden, lime enough to paint a wall, water enough to drown a dog. Lime was not something JCK had known about at the time, but a quick discussion with Robert and a subsequent search in human information databases had revealed it was mostly a calcium-rich solution. Then Jack began to hear the distant rumbles of spacecraft engines. They had heard them looping closer once or twice since the crash, and while the escape pod had managed to be almost completely covered by the canyon walls and the tops of the stony trees overhead, it was only a matter of time before even the pirates' notoriously poor atmospheric sensors picked up something and they came looking. The calcium could be useful, perhaps as a blinding agent against a lone opponent, but JCK was pleasantly surprised when the larger excretion reservoir on the molecular sieve opened after they selected calcium, revealing nearly a full kilogram of loose powdered metal already developing a patina. Carefully using some scraps of plastic paneling, JCK transferred the metal into an empty water canteen, but the sight of the canteen was already making them feel incredibly thirsty. While JYX's species did not require anywhere near the borderline absurd levels of water humans ingested, it was still a shared nutritional need that they both required to function. On the molecular C, JYX selected water. While technically a hybrid molecule instead of a single purified element, it showed very little power consumption requirements, indicating that the multi-atom molecule was already in abundance on Robert's form. This time when the bulk reservoir opened, it was filled nearly to the brim with liters of water. Looking for something to store it in, JCK searched the pod. Unfortunately, one of the fuel reservoirs that would have normally allowed the escape pod to power a short-range flight to safety had been punctured by debris as they had shot free of the ship. Jan recalled seeing the spray of crystallizing fuel shimmering out into the vacuum as they flew toward the unknown planet below. Now it lay empty, stinking faintly of chemicals, but none immediately toxic for GeneX species to consume. With some caution and a little spillage, they poured the water into the ruptured opening of the reservoir and covered the top with another scrap of plastic siding as best they could. The sounds of the searching pirates seemed to be looming closer, and a glance at their newly minted knife confirmed to JCK that stronger countermeasures were necessary. The poem continued to echo in their mind, sulfur enough to stop the fleas, potash enough to wash your shirt. The sulfur was exactly what Jick needed, as it combined nicely with several atmospheric compounds to form a slightly more formidable defense. Carefully preparing a sealable airtight container originally meant for ration supplies, and hoping fervently that fleas were a large category of Earth creature, JCK activated the molecular C. They introduced a string of hydrogen from the ambient atmosphere, again grimacing at the toll it took on the reserve battery. The power was necessary to produce hydrogen sulfide, a toxic and explosive gas. The excretion nozzle they had fitted to the empty food pouch filled the container, the plastic material bulging slightly. Luckily, it held, and JY carefully positioned it near the entrance of the escape pod where a well-thrown piece of debris could rupture it and incapacitate any invaders. Potash was another one that, like lime, required further investigation, but it turned out to be just potassium. Unfortunately, while the metal was, like calcium, somewhat reactive to moisture, it was still unlikely to form anything more than a deterrent, so they had it excreted as a powder, one that again rapidly developed a thin film as it oxidized. It was a far smaller quantity, scarcely more than a dusting. After a few moments' consideration of any other uses, Junk added it to the calcium. The next came the parts of the poem that they knew Robert had in mind with his last words: gold enough to buy a bean, silver enough to coat a pin. They had no idea what a pin or a bean was at the time. Robert had simply said they were small things. Exactly how small had not been mentioned, and so when JY extracted those elements, they were barely visible as a glimmering trace at the bottom of the smallest excretion drawer, so small they could have been missed had the alien not been looking for them. Carefully, they tucked them into a sealable pouch and wedged it between a pair of seat cushions to keep it hidden. Even so, JY knew with grim certainty that the pirates would be far less interested in a few grains of precious metals than in a massive and legendarily powerful device like a molecular sieve and the living hostage to operate it. Unfortunately, the underwhelming potassium, gold, and silver quantities also reminded JY that humans were indeed an impure mismatch of atomic elements. The quantities varied heavily and in many cases were vastly smaller than what they might have hoped. The penultimate lines of the poem contained elements they regarded cautiously: lead enough to ballast a bird. They had seen images of birds, and none on the human's world were larger than a human themselves at best. JY might hope for a single plate or ingot of the metal, and even then only if the poem referred to the largest of birds. Given that many of them were far, far smaller, they suspected lead might be as useless as the tiny beads of gold and silver. Rather than activating the sieve, they advanced to the next element mentioned: phosphor enough to light a town. This might be useful, as phosphorus could be flammable and reactive, but before they could shift their focus, the sounds of the pirate craft grew louder. To their terror, JCK realized the sound had changed. They were approaching. A wild thought came to them. The communication controls on the escape pod had survived the landing but weren't showing enough power to broadcast a call for help, not without blasting so much energy that their crash location would be spotted instantly. But the pirate craft had no such interference. If they flew back into orbit to safely transmit a rescue request, JY realized it meant commandeering one of the pirates' ships would be their best chance of survival. But that required somehow defeating the pilot of such a craft. Their mind went to the line of the poem that had occupied their thoughts for hours: poison enough to kill a cow. They had seen images of a cow, a beast many times larger than a human in mass. The poison it specified was arsenic. This was the vital element JCK had been hoping for, something to give them an edge. The amount of arsenic the molecular sieve produced was a tiny pile, the size of the end of JYX's finger and no larger. Still, it was enough. Carefully, they hydrated it with some of the extracted water and dipped the iron knife blade into the deadly solution. A knife wound on its own might not be enough to overcome a pirate pilot, but a knife coated in poison certainly could. The sounds of the distant ship had stopped now. JCK could hear cries, howls, and weapon fire. They flinched, realizing they faced not one foe but many. An entire hull compartment's worth of pirates had apparently tagged aboard the searching craft and were now spilled forth onto the undefended moon. The sieve showed barely enough power to extract 3 or 4 more elements. Mind racing, Yannick recalled another compound Robert had mentioned, a weapon humans had once discovered and later banned even among their own violent infighting. Extracting it in such a concentrated form would reduce the sieve's reserves to only a single element afterward, but they had little choice. Jick returned to the previous element, phosphor enough to light the town. Again, they specified the form of extraction, this time linking the atoms together to form a single molecule of 4 phosphorus atoms, reducing the overall amount generated to a quarter but creating something far deadlier than plain phosphorus. The result was an innocuous white, waxy substance that scared JYX so much they did not wish to even approach it. Instead, they scrambled for the breathing apparatus stored in the escape pod. 3 sets of masks, tubing, filters, and atmosphere packs were available. Quickly, JCK worked to bring as many filters in line as possible, wrapping them crudely with spare webbing to secure the mask around their face. Breathing through the layers of filters took effort, but it would be necessary. The shouting grew closer. The pod had been spotted. yelled threats, and more weapons fire followed. Several shots landed in and around the cracked entrance of the escape pod, but soon the voices shifted from caution to jubilation as there was no return fire. It appeared to be a clear sign that if anyone was inside, they were defenseless. JCK took a final deep breath. They waited until footsteps, crunching gravel under boots and claws, were just outside the door. Bracing, JY flung the contents of the extraction drawer into the air out the hatchway door before ducking back into the crashed pod. The effect was immediate. Even through the mask's insulation, Jean could hear the sizzle as phosphorus corroded flesh, accompanied by the screeches and screams of those who had inhaled the compound unknowingly, allowing it to decimate soft, vulnerable tissue. One of the pirates, whether by instinct or accident, discharged a laser pistol, igniting the white phosphorus. The screams reached a new peak, the sizzling now a roar and crackle, the sickeningly sweet smell of burning flesh and fabric filling the air. The pirates' voices shifted from terror to agony, begging for the pain to end before falling silent, leaving only the crackling of the burning phosphorus. Occasionally, a pop sounded as some substance or tissue offered brief resistance before yielding to the white fire. After a minute, still masked, JY dared to poke their head out. The sight nearly made them collapse in revulsion. It was as if the sun had reached down and scoured the landscape. Pockets of blindingly bright fire still burned, and even the scraps touching the dead pirates sizzled and flared, continuing to consume whatever they had landed on. In the distance, the faint gleam of the pirates' powercraft stood intact, away off this cursed moon. JCK glanced at the battery indicator on the molecular sieve. Only one more extraction was possible. Retrieving the pouch of gold and silver, they recalled Robert mentioning another elemental form.